Long ago, there was no land here on Mother Earth, just water and creatures of the water. But up above there was a place referred to as Sky World. In Sky World grew the Tree of Life, which grew all kinds of food and provided light. One day, a pregnant woman fell through a hole in the sky. She held in her hand seeds from the Tree of Life. A flock of geese caught her on their backs and carefully lowered her to the back of a sea turtle. The muskrat dove under the water and brought dirt for Sky Woman. The dirt was placed on the turtle's shell. Sky Woman thanked the creatures, then she danced in a counterclockwise direction while she sang. As she did so, she dropped the seeds that she had carried from Sky World. The dirt multiplied, the turtle grew, and the seeds took root and sprouted. Soon Sky Woman gave birth to a daughter who grew up, became the bride of the spirit of the West Wind, and eventually bore twin sons. When it was time to give birth, the right-handed twin was born in the usual way, but his brother, the left-handed twin, pushed his way out through their mother's armpit, which caused her death. They buried their mother, and from her body grew corn, beans, squash, strawberries, and sacred tobacco. Even after her death, the mother of the boys continued to support and nourish them, and so we called this place Mother Earth, for she continues to support and nourish us all. The right-handed twin went about creating all that we see in the natural world: rivers, animals, and plants. The left-handed twin tried to do the same, but wound up creating problems. However, when the boys finished, there was perfect balance: predators and prey, hot and cold, day and night. When Sky Woman passed away, her head was thrown into the sky, where she became Grandmother Moon. She helps us count time, controls the tides, and regulates the monthly cycles of the women, thus ensuring the coming of the future generations. The right-handed twin became the keeper of the day. The left-handed twin became the keeper of the night. The right-handed twin created the human beings and gave them their original instructions. The humans were supposed to take what they needed from the natural world, but only what they needed, and leave the rest for the future generations to enjoy. They were to give thanks each day for all the gifts that have been given in order to sustain life. The humans were instructed to help maintain the balance in the natural world while keeping a good mind. The humans had a difficult time getting along with one another, and so parts of Turtle Island were broken apart and the humans were separated. Today, many people of the world have the ability, technology, and the desire to come together. However, we are still having difficulty remembering that we are all connected by the natural world, dependent on Mother Earth, and related to each other as a species. We are having trouble seeing the beauty and value in one another.
It would be a strange thing if 6 nations of ignorant savages should be capable of forming a scheme for such a union, and be able to execute it in such a manner as that it has subsisted for ages and appears dissoluble, and yet that a like union should be impracticable for 10 or a dozen English colonies. Ben Franklin, 1744.
The Iroquois Confederacy were native peoples of the 6 nations who lived in their ancestral homeland, what is today considered New York State. People of the Longhouse, the Iroquois League, consisted of the 6 nations: the Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, Senecas, and later the Tuscaroras, in a confederacy of mutual protection and support. According to the oral tradition, the founding of the League is the epic tale of the peacemaker who brings a plan of order to the 5 tribes who have been at war with each other. With the support of an Onondagan named Iohata, the evil wizard Tododaho was converted, and the Great Peace began. But with the coming of first contact with Europeans, the Great Peace among the 6 nations would be tested. This farm, like others in the Mohawk Valley, was established in 1671 as a fur trading post to meet Native American traders before they reached the stockaded Dutch settlement of Schenectady.
The history of the Dutch in this area goes back to the very early 1600s. And the main reason for them coming here to this area, upstate New York and the Hudson and Mohawk valleys, was the fur trade. And the Dutch realized that they could make quite a lot of money by coming up to this area and trading with the local Native American tribes for furs to export back to Europe. And that's how the Dutch ended up here, and then later the English as well, and that continued throughout the 16 and 1700s. The fur trade was what brought people here.
Iroquois populations were becoming increasingly dependent on European goods. This dependence created an ever-growing demand for furs, one that quickly grew depleted. In the 1630s, the Iroquois began raiding on neighboring territories to the north and east, seeking furs for Dutch and later English trade goods. The attacks fueled competition between two trade networks, one consisting of the Algonquin, Huron, and French, the other of the Iroquois and Dutch, later supplanted by the English. The global competition between two European rivals eventually turned into a great war between the French and the English in North America, with native peoples caught in the middle.
The primary role of Sir William Johnson as British Superintendent of Indian Affairs during the French and Indian War was to gain the friendship and alliance of the entire Six Nations and other nations and draw their alliance away from the French. Sir William had a couple of familial connections to the Mohawks. The first was his long-held adoption by the Mohawks. They named him, they made him an honorary sachem. This would have been a great honor for him and an act of esteem and trust on their part. The other was his relationship with Molly Brant. She was the lady of the house at Fort Johnson and Johnson Hall. They had 9 children together, 8 survived. After the American Revolution, one of their sons, George, writes in a deposition that his mother and father were joined in a manner conformable to her people, which would have served, for them, would have served as a marriage.
With the victory over the French in the French and Indian War, Iroquois and other native peoples were fearful of potential British designs on their territory. The Northern Department was powerless to restrain encroaching settlers, including land speculation by Sir William Johnson himself, who claimed 100,000 acres. After a brief uprising led by Pontiac, the native peoples were subdued. The only positive result from Pontiac's war for the Iroquois and other tribes was the Royal Proclamation of 1763, setting boundaries between Indian land to the west upon an expanding frontier of squatters. In 1768, in a revised plan, the Mohawks ceded land to the east and south of Fort Stanwix, current-day Rome, New York, through surrogates of Sir William Johnson, effectually passing the Mohawk Valley into the hands of European settlers. The only remaining Mohawk land was in the Adirondacks at the time of the Revolution.
When the American Revolution began to be talked about, when the colonies started to talk about rejecting the crown, and although there was a lot of emphasis on remaining neutral at first, a lot of people got drawn into the war. The request was to stay out of it, but I think behind the scenes they were sending people around to recruit people to get them to, you know, actively participate. So on the surface it was like, oh no, we're good, we're okay, but they did gather hundreds of warriors to fight on both sides. So although the majority were pro-British, so it just seemed like the logical thing to do for those people to go with the British Empire. They're the biggest, baddest power on earth. Who has the courage to stand up to that?
The Dutch term, covenant chain, became a symbol of the ties between indigenous nations and the crown throughout the colonial period. With the division among the settlers between loyalists and patriots, The Six Nations were at first neutral, but later had to choose sides. The chain was ultimately broken when individuals and groups of Oneida and Tuscarora supported the Patriot side. In 1779, with the influence of Colonel Guy Johnson, Sir William Johnson's successor, and Mohawk chief Joseph Brant, the Mohawks, Onondagas, Cayugas, and Senecas sided with the British. The Oneidas and Tuscaroras, influenced by missionary Samuel Kirkland of New England, came over to the Patriot cause. The strain on the Iroquois Confederacy began with a British plan of invading New York from Canada, with the goal of splitting the colonies in half. With General John Burgoyne heading south for Montreal, and another British force under Brevet Brigadier General Barry St. Leger heading east from Forts Oswego and Niagara, it became essential to secure full military support from the Iroquois. The British could not send an army through Iroquois land without their permission and without overturning their neutrality.
Particularly for St. Leger's part of the expedition, the Indian support, primarily the Haudenosaunee or Six Nations Indian, as the British colonials more often referred to them, their support was seen as absolutely critical to this expedition. Most of St. Leger's anticipated manpower they had planned on coming from the Six Nations Indians, honoring their older agreements with the British to serve as allies in time of warfare. Fort Stanwix was built to block any enemy movements coming out of Canada, and so General St. Leger was first going to have to take the fort before he could continue on down the Mohawk River, where he and Burgoyne planned to meet up at Albany. In the end, he basically just kind of lost his nerve and decided retreat was the better part of discretion or valor, and ended the siege and retreated back towards Canada. Basically, it was the Indians' experience, the bad experience overall they had in supporting the British in regular military operations here, that led them particularly into deciding they needed to follow their own more traditional way of war. They decided rather than trying to take the Mohawk Valley, they would basically destroy one of the major breadbasket supplying Washington's army.
This settlement was a very integrated settlement. There was the Indian, famous Indian guide who was killed at Oriskany, and that's Spencer. He lived here with his wife and children. He was a full-blooded Oneida Indian. And Joseph Brant made regular forays here because he had a lot of friends here. And a lot of these, it was a divided community, but you'd never really know it. Butler had his Butler's Rangers. There was a group of regular militia with him. I think there was 80 men. And then there was a ton of loyalists who really had some axes to grind because they lost everything in the Mohawk Valley. They were run out of the Mohawk Valley. They get in, they kill, they scalp, they raid, and they get out.
Right wheel! Wheel! Check in!
Butler's Rangers do the same thing because they move with the Indians. But the regular militia, they're firing on everybody, and Butler's firing on everybody. And meanwhile, the Butler's Rangers, a lot of them, the loyalists who have really big axes to grind, and the natives, the Seneca in particular, and are just going amok. And right at daybreak, right about 8 o'clock in the morning, Butler attacks again. So they attack the second time. And it's the first time that innocent men, women, and children were just hacked apart. They were just left to die.
Rebel propaganda depicted all Native victories as massacres, painted Brant as a monster, and accused him of atrocities during battles he may not have been present at. With the successful raiding of Iroquois and their Tory allies along the frontier, George Washington ordered that Iroquois land not be merely overrun, but destroyed. In summer 1779, an expedition under the command of Generals John Sullivan and James Clinton set out to conquer the raiding natives by burning their villages and crops. At the end of the American Revolution, Native peoples found themselves alone.
As far as visible, continuous Iroquois presence, there was really, literally none in this region after the Revolutionary War. Some people may have stuck around, but they did so by keeping a very low profile and not drawing attention to their indigenous heritage. The Oneidas and Tuscaroras, despite the fact that they sided with the American colonists and provided them with important aid, were treated no better than any of the others of the Six Nations. They found themselves stripped of their land. They found themselves forced to move. There was, by the way, interestingly enough, after the Revolution, a plan put forward and supported by none other than Benjamin Franklin that there should be a Native American state to the west of New York. That plan fell through. But Franklin himself was a great friend of Native people and indeed credited the Haudenosaunee with giving the 13 colonies the idea of joining together, and the American Constitution owes a great debt to its formation being copied from, in large part, the League of the Haudenosaunee.
In 1600, there were only a handful of Europeans. In 1700, there were 250,000. By 1800, more than 5 million non-natives occupied native land throughout the eastern seaboard. By 1800, many Iroquois place names had been changed to fit the European mind view, with places like Syracuse, Rome, Ithaca, Homer, and Ovid, to name a few. Disease from smallpox, liquor, and land swindling were used to cheat and decimate the Iroquois. It all seemed like another lost cause.
Although many non-Native Americans have learned very little about us, over time we have had to learn everything about them. Wilma Mankiller, Every Day is a Good Day, Reflections by Contemporary Indigenous Women.
I think the light went on in the 70s. They weren't learning anything about the culture or the language in the public school systems. This school has a huge history. It started out of community conflict, and the people that were involved in that conflict and the Mohawk Nation people started this school. And I've liked their vision that they had at that time, that they would not ask the federal government or the state for help.
It's all done in the language, and the focus of our curriculum and our teaching is the cycle of ceremonies and Gainalekgoa, which is the Great Law, Galihuio, different in how, we're following nature, like how things are going, and they're able to go outside and study things or go look for trees, or when it's maple time, they go tap trees and they help boil syrup and all of that. They do gardens and they do food. They can food, and if there's an opportunity to go fishing, they'll go fishing, like whatever's going on and at that time in nature, we follow that, as well as like giving thanks and all of that, and it's all done in the language.
I have a bone that I want to pick. I don't know why everybody, not just people who visit us, but they always ask us, well, how do they transition into public school. And I'm like, they do. It's not that hard. And then, like, even our own people will say, well, do they have a hard time? And I'm like, I don't get that question. To me, that question is something that was put into their minds a long time ago when we were being oppressed and punished. I mean, there were people who went to residential school and they were punished for speaking their indigenous languages. Same with here. I mean, we had nuns teaching us when I went to school, and they were abusive and they punished our people for speaking their language. You know, and somebody asked me what my vision for the future is yesterday, and I was like, I want to end racism, but I don't know, is that possible?
Rebirth takes many forms. The resurgence of Longhouse spirituality, the revitalization of native languages, and the growth of Iroquois nationalism. The Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, are still with us, and more than that, environmentalism, self-government, and women's rights have been influential Iroquois themes in modern times. They have shown us another path to peace.
Most notably, the Oneidas and Tuscaroras provided help for the American cause. In fact, brought food to Valley Forge, and at that time I think Washington's troops might have starved if it were not for the fact of those indigenous people coming to their aid.
You might hear the term the covenant chain of peace and friendship. Well, that is an alliance between the British and the native allies that they had, the original Iroquois Confederacy. And so that term, the chain, was like a common metaphor for alliance.
When you start making history politically correct, you start creating a fairy tale, and you start glossing it over. And it isn't the way it should be. We should be able to be adult enough and mature enough to confront what happened to us as people and to say, hey, this is not going to happen again.